创始人 Mark Wuzan 先生，有请。
Now let's welcome the moderator, Mr. Mark Wuzan, the Executive Director, Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee.
Okay, good morning everyone, and thank you very much for joining our sessions this morning entitled Can Nations Agree? Orchestrating International Cooperation in an Uncertain World. So my name is Mark Wuzan. I'm the founder and the director of the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee, and I would like to first thank the organizer for the invitation to participate again as one of the partners for this important annual conference. And I'm very pleased that the debate we will be discussing today will be clearly the future of the global economic order, the future of multilateralism, and we are going to see major tensions in the global financial system. And our co-author and panelists will be discussing with me here what do we see next and what kind of scenario we can think about when we look at the global economic order today. Let me try to introduce quickly our panelists, and I will ask them to join the floor. Professor Xi Kang, special term professor at Tsinghua PBCSF and a professor of economics at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Professor Xi, please, welcome. Lord Malone Brown, the former Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations and head of the UNDP. And Mark has been leading an important initiative called Bretton Woods at 80, and will provide us a sense of where we stand today in the future of the Bretton Woods institutions. Mark, please, if you can join also the floor. Eric Bergloff, the chief economist of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Eric was for many long time in the multilateral institution, including the EBRD. Eric. And last but not least, Maximiliano Castelli, the managing director and head of strategy at UBS, following carefully central banks and central banking. Okay, great. So good morning, and as I mentioned today, our sessions, Can Nations Agree? Orchestrating International Cooperation in the Uncertain World. The way we are going to put together these sessions, I'm going to try to ask a couple of questions to our panelists, and after this we will engage with the audience. This session is live, media have been invited, so we'll be able to engage with the audience. Yesterday night at a dinner we have been discussing the future of the global economic order. This morning also there was a lot of references about the underpinnings of this global financial system. And one of the first questions I want to ask our speakers here is the following. Is a post-1944 economic order that was built on liberal trade, dollar centrality, and multilateral institutions gone? That would be the first question. Maybe you saw an article written in the Financial Times by Martin Wolf about the end of the global economic order. Last week, when we were all heading to Washington for the IMF and the World Bank meeting in Washington, the big questions for all delegates was, is the US will withdraw from the IMF and the World Bank? So this is exactly the current context where we are going to discuss this. So this is not something abstract, this is very concrete, and I think it will have major consequences. If we want to build an inclusive global financial system, we need to understand exactly what's next. Is it a turning point in history? So let me start with Mark. Mark, please. Is a global economic order as we knew it, and the underpinnings of this order is gone? Over to you, and thank you for joining.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you to our hosts at Tsinghua for arranging this wonderful meeting. It's a real crisis. The global system is threatened by the recent actions of the US on tariffs particularly, but the consequences of that, questioning about both multilateralism in general, but the role of the dollar, the role of international trade, And, to the extent that an alternative has been articulated to a multilateral system, it is one in which the new American, or new and old American President Trump in his second term, has called for a Yalta-type arrangement of spheres of influence led by major powers. And I think the challenge now is to the rest of the world, including China, as to whether to accept that new arrangement of global political economic arrangements. And I think it's very much in the hands of the Chinese, the Europeans, and the developing world to either go along with a new arrangement which would almost certainly lead to much lower levels of global growth and development, and to potentially much more political instability, and to the failure to address major shared global public goods problems like climate. It's in our power to decide whether to go along with that or to stand up for the multilateral system, a theme we heard articulated both last night and by the speakers earlier this morning. And, I think it's really important, both speaking here in China, but speaking as a European in China, that China and the US, China and Europe, are resolute in standing up for that multilateral system. And I would just say that, for many years, meetings of the World Bank and the IMF and other international fora such as the United Nations have been heavily around the need to devolve power from such a singular dependence on the US in these institutions to much more devolved ownership. There might be debate about how that increased ownership by others should be shared out, what should be the ownership of China in the World Bank and the IMF, what should China's role be at the United Nations, what should that of other developing countries, what reduction should Europe make in its role to enable this. So there was not agreement on what a new ownership structure of these institutions should look like. And there was also a view that the US would for quite a long while, if not indefinitely, remain the single biggest shareholder in these institutions or influence in these institutions, but that their health and legitimacy required a new power arrangement. And so I think, the question to the rest of the world is be careful what you wish for. That moment when the US has signaled its desire to lessen its role in these institutions, to essentially lessen the power of the dollar in the global economy, is one where either our response is a panicked one of crisis, or it's to say a moment that we all thought should come has come earlier than we anticipated in a much more rushed and crisis-like way than we would have hoped. But it does provide an opportunity to reset the international system to better reflect today's distribution of economic and political power in the world. And so, as an American politician said, never waste a good crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Eric, first, is the global economic order as we knew it is gone? And if this is the case, maybe, as Mark was mentioning, let's use this opportunity maybe to build something better. Over to you, please.
Thank you, and also thank you very much for inviting me. So I will build actually on what Mike Spence said earlier, and take very much the perspective of emerging and developing economies, because I think they are very much at the receiving end of what's going on. And in one way, you can think of what's happening right now as the sort of last gasp of a unipolar world, where we have seen very fundamental shifts in the global economy towards a more multipolar world. And the relative economic powers shifted, and really in that structure that Mark was describing so well, determine all it could not fully pursue its own interests. And we could say it's a small consolation that with the current trade policies, if we had been in a fully unilateral or unipolar world, the consequences would have been even greater. So I think it's exactly in this situation that we have now where the multilateral system becomes even more important. But of course, we need to have a new multilateralism that truly reflects this new order. And as Mark was saying, these institutions have not fully reflected these changes in the global economy. And we have to find new expressions and perhaps also new institutions that are more reflective of the new order. And of course, the consequences now particularly for Mark's previous employer, the UN system today is extremely grave. And a lot of job cuts, a lot of rethinking is needed to deal with this new reality. And of course, this is the part of the global system that is where developing and emerging economies have the most influence and also most depend on. And of course, now these economies will also require massive investments and massive transfers of technology to deal with climate change and nature loss. And at this time, to have this massive uncertainty, policy uncertainty that we have not seen ever since we started measuring the policy uncertainty, not even during the global financial crisis or during COVID, did we have the same level of policy uncertainty in all major markets. And this, again, for countries that really need investment and trade, this is very unfortunate, very bad. But I still don't want to completely undermine or play down the strength of the global system, because I think there are parts of the global system that are actually working. And I would say that the multilateral development banks that I represent have actually gone through a period of quite significant change. We're working much more together now. We do a lot of co-financing. AIB is the largest co-financier of the World Bank and the ADB. Co-financing is a very important tool to get commonality of standards, to create more transparency, to also open up more for the private sector to come into these development efforts. It's also an opportunity to bring in system. We have done very fundamental changes in our capital adequacy framework, how we put away capital for risk, and that has released a lot of capital from the MDB system. So yes, that system is still alive and well and kicking and working more as a system than it did in the past. And of course, I represent the new MDB that is very much owned by the emerging world. We have two very strong shareholder interests in China and Europe, but actually the most interesting part of AIB is the fact that the majority is controlled by the emerging and developing world. And it really changes the nature of the conversation, because I worked at another institution that was controlled very much by the G7, and where the countries where we actually operated have very little influence. And I think that is what I see is a very different conversation, and it's exactly the conversation that we have in the board today that we need to have at the global level. We need to find coalitions of the willing. We need to find opportunities to collaborate. I'm not very optimistic that, for example, EU and China will start working together in Europe, and that there will be a major openness to Chinese technology, particularly in the low carbon space, coming into Europe. But I think there are very major opportunities for Europe and China to work together in the emerging world. Europe has a lot of insights into how to run effective energy systems. There are also some real technological strength. China has massive technological strength. there's a lot of opportunities to work together. Doing the climate agenda, it can only work now through some kind of coalition of the willing. And I think the fundamental challenge that we see now for the emerging and developing world, that these countries are being asked to choose which sphere of influence it wants to be part of. But this is not what these countries want. These countries want to have the choice and want to be able to get the most appropriate technology at the cheapest price, and of course also get capital that it can invest in these technologies. So I think in Africa there's this saying that when the big elephants dance, the grass suffers. And I think that's really what's happening right now. And that's where the multilateral system is more important than ever. It is for these countries that we need these coalitions of the willing, and we need to move the system forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Professor Shi, if I can put you on the spot. So my first question was clearly to set the stage, to clearly understand if this global economic order is gone or not. But I want to ask you also specific questions about China. You know, when we travel and we come abroad, everyone is asking, what is the view of China? So I want to ask you the following. China has been a major beneficiary of globalization, of global economic integrations, but there was always a sense of frustrations that the weight of China in the global financial architecture, particularly at the IMF and the World Bank, didn't really reflect the weight of China. So now, do you concur that we are at a turning point in terms of global governance? And if this is the case, so what China should do? If China is going to be a way to be a new anchor in the system? We have been seeing over the last few years the creation of different institutions, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank. I think Governor Zhu yesterday mentioned many swap lines among central banks. So do you see that China is going to become maybe, at least maybe an innovator in global governance? And this is the case, under what parameters this innovation can come from? Over to you.
Okay, thanks for Mark. Thanks for organizing this very interesting conversation and these kind of good questions. So I'm a professor of the economics from China University, Hong Kong. My research is on the the open macro, money policy, and the Chinese economy. So I have been studied, global financial and the money system, global imbalance for a long time. My PhD thesis is about the money policy under the dollar standard. So I have a bunch of papers about the global balance. So as a professor of economics who study the global imbalance, we know what really happens about the global imbalance. So that we thought definitely tariff issue cannot be the right thing to address this issue. So like most of people, so we are very disappointed about the current global global political development. So why China and the US just reached a temporary 90 days kind of buffer agreement, but the future or the look of the global cooperation is not optimistic. So it would be a very difficult time for the global cooperation or global talk. So in some sense, so global cooperation might be a luxury goods for us now. So that's, I think, my first kind of the judgment. We're not very optimistic. So, and from the China point of view, you ask, what the global order looks like. I think China government has expressed very clearly. Okay, China advocate the multilateralism, mutual benefit, and equality, and to solve all the issues under the framework of the United Nations, the trade dispute under the WTO framework. So China don't like bullying. China wants the respect. I think that's China want to do. even China, advocated, the BIA initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative. So when China do business with Africa, South Asia, basically we follow the business model. So when we want the resource from Africa, we give them the infrastructure. When we want to the market from the Vietnam, Thailand, okay, we investment. Okay, that's what we do. So that we believe that this is the right thing to do. So we never will say bully the neighbor and say, okay, give us something like the other country do. That's not the Chinese model. So, but we never believe that what the Chinese the way is a kind of new model or new. China just using the own way to do the kind of business or to interact with the other countries. So we never want to overturn the kind of the existing model, because China also gain from them. So we like the traditional kind of model. So only we want to add more fairness and make this kind of the current global system more kind of inclusive. Okay, like the title we highlight. So for the global order or global cooperation, we think that this really depends on our consensus. If you believe that globalization is a good thing, okay, easy to cooperate. If not, then I think it will be challenging for most of us. So in the past kind of 40 years, so a lot of countries and people gain from the globalization. So especially I think China. China is the one gain the mostly. So, but of course, during this kind of the globalization process, I think some group or some people are hurt. But that is the responsibility of for the the countries. They should take care of them. So that, but it's usually difficult to do the internal kind of economic reform. So that the easy way is to to condemn the others. Okay, that's I think in this kind of situation, China is the scapegoat. But of course, I think we totally understand, kind of doing, even is very fair, very, so following the so-called marketing rule, but still may have the negative effect on the others. That's something China want to, to think about. But I think this need a kind of time to make Chinese realize that, okay, it's not always good to produce the good quality, cheap price to the others, okay? Maybe they don't like it, okay? May they hurt that. That's something I think in the very beginning, Chinese people will not realize that. I think this take time. So I think from the Chinese side, we also need to, think about, to what extent we need to, produce. Okay, how much to produce, how much to export. So I think the good thing is that now Chinese government has realized the importance. As a big country, we could never or always rely on the overseas market. So we needed to rely on the, the domestic consumption. So that we needed to make the transition from the market, the export-oriented kind of economy to the consumption-driven economic growth. Okay, I think the Chinese government or the Chinese firm has realized that this point. So that China also has a very kind of the important change. In the recent kind of the important meeting, I think the first point, the first kind of the task in the 2025 is about the consumption. is how to, stimulate consumption, how to, to generate a domestic kind of demand for the Chinese economy. So that's, I think, we realize the problem, okay? So that's also, but this take time, take time. So you may ask, is there any kind of the new model for the global? I think at this moment, I think we are far away from that. So there's still below kind of the transition from the new to the old model to the new model. So, and this process is dynamic, it's not stable. So there must be like a conflict, then some demand for kind of cooperation, okay, like the 90 days kind of buffer agreement. So then broken, conflict, cooperation, so that, so during this process, it's take a long time to reach this kind of cooperation. So that both sides, I think, especially I think the Chinese government realized that, okay, so the cooperation is not sustainable. Okay. Chinese government basically will focus on their own business. Okay, we will explore the other market other than the U.S. market. We will focus on our innovation. We will focus on the domestic kind of market to make the firm to switch from the manufacturer to the service sector, those kind of things. That's, I think, Chinese government has realized that what is the right thing to do, but it takes time. So I think the success of the Chinese economy depends on the economic reform, not from the, any kind of other kind of the outside kind of things. So I think the U.S. should have the same problem as well. So finally, I want to say something about the U.S. and the China. I think that will be the conflict will be last for a long, long time. Okay, it has been since 2018, so it has been 8 years. So Chinese has learned a lot from this kind of things. They know how to deal with this kind of external shock, tariff war, and so meanwhile, you can see that Chinese make huge progress in the different field. Okay, for example, we now have this kind of the new energy kind of sector, the EV sector, and even we have the bigger progress in the larger aircraft. So, so that Chinese like the cooperation. Okay, we gain from the cooperation, but if there's no cooperation, actually we realize that it's not sustainable. So we never put all the hope on the kind of the cooperation. So we will do our business. So that's I think even with the put in the worst case, okay, there will always complicate. I think Chinese economy can survive because we have the the largest market. Okay, the only thing is how to stimulate the market, and we all have the complete kind of industry chains and the huge kind of production capacity. But for the U.S. side, I think this time the tariff is different from the 2018 because the U.S. is experiencing high inflation and high debt, and also I think the U.S. administration is trying to fight with all the rest of the world. Okay, so now the pressure on the U.S. side is not from the China. It's from the whole world, from the global investment, from the financial market. Okay, so that's I think they should realize that this kind of if the U.S. understand what's the situation and know that okay if there's no way to block China's economic growth. Maybe you can slow down, but Chinese still will continue to grow because they know what's the right thing to do. So I think for a rational kind of strategy is to instead is how the tariff kind of war between the U.S. and China. Instead, you should like China, what China do in the maybe 40 years ago, open the market and welcome the Chinese firm to investment in the U.S. market to help the U.S. to rebuild this infrastructure, and that will be really help the return of the manufacturing, because tariff, the price, the relative price is not is a small thing. The return of the manufacturing in the U.S. rely on the systematic approach, the infrastructure, the talent, and a lot of things. Okay, and also I think the U.S. needed to realize that U.S. don't need to beat or ahead of China in all the aspects. U.S. has the strength in the Wall Street, in the Silicon Valley, in the higher education sector, and those kind of things. So that's, U.S. needed to be more confident about that. Finally, I think if U.S. worry about the special law of the U.S. dollar in the international system has become a burden for the U.S. They want to take a break. I think it's good time for the the renminbi to take some law of them. But from a Chinese point of view, I think we never ask for that. We don't want to do that. But as a bigger country, I think China has the responsibility to do something. Okay, although the renminbi is not fully convertible, so that we're not ready for that. Okay. So finally, I want to say that the world is so big. Okay, so that it's big enough to accompany two major countries like US and China, and even more. That's my kind of comments on for the global cooperation and current conflict. Thanks.
Thank you. You mentioned, and you give me a good transition to go to Maximiliano Castelli. You mentioned the role of the dollar in the international monetary system. And indeed, when we think about the global economic order, World War II, we think about the Bretton Woods institution, but of course, the role of the dollar in the international monetary system. So Max, do you think that the recent statement from the Trump administration, when you have Secretary of State Mr. Rubio mentioned that the international order is working against the US, trade war, centrality of the dollar, and how investors are reacting? We see this episode during Liberation Day, quote unquote, in April. Do you see something structural is happening here when we think about the role of the dollar in the international monetary system? Over to you, please.
Thank you, Mark. And first of all, I would like to thank Tsinghua University for inviting me again. This is the second year that I have this opportunity, and I'm really grateful for being part of this event. There is no doubt that, I'm the head of strategy for UBS, for sovereign wealth funds and central banks, and since Liberation Day, several central banks contacted us, and the question was all about the role of the US dollar as a reserve currency in the current geopolitical environment. Now, the fact that the central banks are looking at their US dollar allocation in the sense that they are questioning whether there has been any change in the safe haven status of the US dollar is actually unprecedented. In the sense I've been around in this business for more than 20 years, not even after the great financial crisis, the role of the dollar as the ultimate safe haven has ever been put into question. So this fact already gives an idea of the sort of phase that we are living in at the moment and the level of uncertainty that we have in financial market. Now this leads, so central banks are definitely, Liberation Day has been a wake-up call, no doubt about that. I don't want to go through the whole, what happened after Liberation Day, but in the jargon that we use in the industry, the positive correlation between the US dollar and volatility in markets or geopolitical volatility basically broke down. There has been the US Treasury normally receive a lot of flows when uncertainty goes up. This didn't happen. Actually, we see outflow from the US Treasury market. I believe this, and I think Michael Spencer, the Nobel Prize who spoke before, mentioned this very clearly. This was the limit which the market has put to Trump. Something to keep in mind, that there are also limits to what Trump can do, and these limits are not coming from other governments, but actually is coming from the market. And this is very important to fix it, because it means that also Trump cannot do more than a certain amount of damage to the global economy. But this, of course, leads to the question that you raise. The question is, are we seeing the beginning of the weakening of the dollar status as the dominant reserve currency in the system? And of course, the follow-up question is, if this is the case, which other currency are going to benefit? Now, it is interesting to know that so far, the main beneficiary of the turmoil around the dollar, and I would say of the turmoil around geopolitics over the last few years, including the impact of the Ukraine conflict, Russia has been targeted by sanctions. Actually, the main beneficiary has not been over currency, has been the gold. If you look at gold, has been in net demand among central banks. Largely, we are talking about central banks for emerging markets, including China, is a public information. And they've been adding gold a big way. And this trend actually has been reinforced by Liberation Day, by the unilateral action taken by the Trump administration. The point is that, unfortunately, gold cannot replace the dollar as a safe haven, because it doesn't have the characteristic of a safe haven. First of all, there is a problem of liquidity, in the sense that central banks want to rely on reserves which are liquid, so that allow them to intervene in the FX market if needed. Gold does not have that characteristic, particularly when you buy physical gold. It is in liquid. Of course, it can be sold, but it takes time to be liquidated, and for sure, you cannot intervene in the bond market with gold. And the second fact is that the central banks do not have the control of the supply of oil, which is another big impediment, while of course they have the control of the currency that they issue in the country. So what about the competitors? What about the other competitors, the currency, which inevitably will have to receive more funding if there is diversification away from the dollar? And these, of course, the two main competitors are the euro and the RMB. Now, there is a lot of optimism about the euro, and that's something that I haven't seen for a very long time. This optimism about the euro is dictated by the fact that there is this vision, and I think it was made very clear by the Polish ex-prime minister in his opening, in his remarks, that in the end, Europe tends to act when it is under pressure. And there is this view that this is one of these moments, because of Trump, because of the NATO, because of the attack on trade, that Europe needs to pull itself together and make those reforms which are required in order to make the euro a more attractive international currency. The problem is that this type of reform are fundamentally two, at least as far as currency are concerned. The first one is the fiscal union. Of course, basically, if you look at the amount of debt which is issued at the European level from the ESM, it is still very limited. And by the way, it is not even considered government bond. It is a supranational, because there is no European fiscal treasury issuing bonds. In order to see the euro attracting a significant share of FX reserve as central banks start to diversify from the dollar, we need to see more fiscal union. This is something that is a wish at the moment, but there are a lot of doubts whether this will happen over the foreseeable future. The second point is about financial integration. This is another very important topic. Actually, this is for me the low-hanging fruit for Europe, for a very simple reason. In order to do the fiscal union, you need unanimity. Financial integration, you can vote by majority. So if, and I quote again the Polish ex-prime minister, if Europe wants to move ahead because a group of countries wants to move ahead, actually in the area of financial integration, Europe has the political capital to do it, simply because they don't have to have the vote of everybody. So if the largest country, Germany, France, Italy, decide to move ahead there and make reform, this is actually feasible. The second currency, which of course is in the discussion and has been in the radar screen of central bank, has been the RMB. The RMB has, the euro has some limitation, the RMB has over limitation. It has already been mentioned, the fact that it is not a fully convertible currency yet. Convertibility is a very important element. However, we should not forget that the RMB, starting from a very low level, increased its share of reserve already without convertibility. Then what happened in the last few years is that the rise in the share of the RMB in the global FX reserve has slowed down, I believe not just because of the convertibility, but more because of two factors. One, the US-China confrontation, sanction risk, which has created uncertainty. And the second one, it is about the fact that the low yield environment that we have in China. China is lowering interest rate. There is a massive differential in interest rate differential between the dollar and the RMB. And at the moment, actually, has become probably at the max of the last few years. This is definitely a factor which prevents many investors from going into the RMB, but I think the potential is there. So what are investors doing? Do they talk about this? Are they acting in the sense, sorry if I talk as a banker, are they moving funds? Do we see outflows from the US towards the euro, towards the RMB, or towards over-reserve currency like the sterling, the Australian dollar, etc.? My answer is not yet. We definitely saw outflows out of the US equity market, but this was already happening before Liberation Day. This was largely because of very high valuation in the tech stocks of the US. This is continuing. But in the fixed income space, we are just at the beginning of an adjustment in the portfolio of central banks and institutional investors, which I think will lead to a gradual decrease of the share of the US dollar. We should not forget the US dollar was already declining as a share of global FX reserve. It went from a peak of more than 70%. We are now below 60%. It was a steady decline, which was very much in line with the new reality of the global economy, in the sense that we have a new economy like China having a much higher weight in the global international financial system. I believe that what we are going to see, this is the most likely scenario, it is maybe an acceleration in this steady decline, but nothing comparable to an imminent demise of the US dollar as the dominant reserve currency, largely because of lack of alternative. Two final points which you raised at the beginning in your opening remark. Of the multilateral order. I think the dollar is just one aspect of the story. It is a financial aspect. Sometimes it's also something. It is really, it is something which is discussed very much only in financial market circle. But here I will use a quote that, allow me to use my Italian fellow Mario Draghi, who has been a champion of the European integration, and I'm quoting him in a recent speech that he gave in Portugal just a few days ago, where he said that the use of unilateral action by the US to solve trade dispute, together with a total delegitimization of the WTO, has fundamentally weakened the multilateralism in a way that is, according to Draghi, irreversible. So what does it mean? So the first question we need to ask ourselves is whether the global order has been, the multilateral order that has been the driver of the big reform of the last, at least in the post-war period, is actually been in a way damaged in a irreversible way. And I believe the answer is yes, probably, in the sense that there are not the conditions. Think about the role of WTO, but also IMF, World Bank, the multilateral institution. They do not appear to be in a position to be the driver of this new political order. So the question is, what is going to happen in the near future and eventually over the next few years? And here I was reading just in the last few days a very nice quote, which is actually was written in 1929 from an Italian philosopher called Gramsci. Some of you might know him. And it is actually a very, very illuminating. And he was saying, and we're talking about 1929, so this was the period of a big change in the global economy. Hopefully not, we will not go in that direction. But he was saying the old world is dying and the new world is structured to be born. Now it is the time of monsters. I found this quote very, very instructive because it really gives an idea of the environment that we are in. We are in a transition phase which started probably already well before Trump. I believe it started after the great financial crisis in 2008. These transition phases are likely to be long. They don't have to last only a few years. It could also last the whole decade. And we're living in a sort of a twilight when we have this massive amount of uncertainty. And this is probably something that we have to get used to it, in the sense that we do not see yet the sort of sign of a new global order emerging. Hopefully it will come very soon. And Michael Spencer mentioned that maybe the third most likely scenario is that the whole rest of the world will move ahead and wait for the US to join. I'm a little bit skeptical about this view. I don't think you can reform the global financial system without the US being a main stakeholder in that decision-making process.
All of you here to really come up with some very good analysis about my first question related to the global economic order. Now, let's try to think. As you said, Max, you mentioned coalition of the willing, alliance of corporations. So Mark, if I can come back to you, you initiated and you were working before the arrival of the Trump administration, trying to advise the managing director of the IMF and the president of the World Bank, really thinking about Bretton Woods for the future. After 80 years, there was clearly a sense that a lot of reform were needed in terms of the governance of the international institutions, about their mission, about their role, because the world was changing. What have you learned from this exercise so far, number one? And two, when we think about maybe a new Bretton Woods moment or a coalition of the willing, who can initiate this, under what terms? And as you said, can we do something without the US? Over to you.
Well, look, I think that absolutely, as Max just said, is the challenge, can we? And, you know, the Gramsci quote, I'm pleased to report to you, is used now frequently in conferences like this, because I think, as you put it, we are in that twilight moment when there's been huge damage done to the old system. It's uncertain if it can survive. It's uncertain what are the changes necessary to make it survive. But let me just say, as we've looked at the role of the IMF and the World Bank, and I've been doing this with a former Prime Minister from Africa and the current Finance Minister of Indonesia, so we're a diverse trio. You know, what I think, you know, has become clear is that whatever these challenges of governance and whatever the sort of recent period of behavior by the major shareholder, the US, the need for these institutions has actually started to grow exponentially from a period when they were in relative decline relative to the size of the global economy. Now, why do I say it's jumping exponentially? And let me just quickly cite three reasons, if you like. First is a lost part of what's happened, Eric touched on it with the crisis in the United Nations, is the collapse of ODA, of Overseas Development Assistance, the main vehicle of grant finance, typically from primarily Western donors, but not exclusively. And that money, you know, most notably has dried up because of the actions against USAID out of Washington, but actually had been preceded by dramatic cuts in development finance in Europe as well. And so we're in a situation of a vast shrinkage of grant finance. And this makes the concessional finance available from the MDB system much more critical than ever. And so the first part of my argument is, in terms of financing development, these institutions are more important than ever. And, you know, I would even go so far as to say that for many developing countries, they actually, in the longer term, although the short-term costs are huge in terms of risks to the lives of people on different health interventions or educational or food support, in the longer term, a lot of governments welcome the because they see it as more predictable, more long-term. They have greater agency over it. It's not being driven by donor priorities. Potentially, they'd like to see a much larger volume of it, and they see it leads more easily to a transition to drawing in private finance in additional to this public finance. So the MDB system's role is likely to be more central than ever. And I say system because I think the other thing that's come through very clearly to us is you shouldn't look at the World Bank and IMF as two sort of lonely islands. They are parts of much bigger networks. And if you take the bank again for a moment, it is Eric's institution, the AIIB, as well as the regional development banks, but a whole network of national development institutions as well, running into hundreds. So put the whole system together, and several things become clear. One, if you could better mobilize capital through it with an element of government-provided guarantee to provide subsidy to that capital and reduce its costs, it is the likely future of development finance. And it is a system, when you take its total ownership, that is not so indisputably owned by the US. The US isn't even a member of the AIIB. Most of the regional development banks have very strong elements of regional ownership, not just of Western or major other power ownership. So take the system as a whole, and it's already got a more diverse ownership. So I think that's point one. Point two, if I could make, is about the IMF. The current uncertainty and, frankly, near chaos that we've seen in recent months reflects a world where we are almost certainly going to see increases in financial crises. But I think what the IMF has noticed, but which sometimes we're all a little bit lazy about not recognizing, is most financial crises, even when they're called global ones, are actually regional. I mean, even the global financial crisis of 2009, I was at the time in the UK government and was the ministerial sort of Sherpa sent around the world to drum up support for the financial crisis G20 summit in London. And, you know, I was sent around with the message, this is a global crisis, and China and others responded dramatically by allowing my Prime Minister to announce a massive global war chest to stop the panic in the markets. But the striking aftermath of that was that actually both Asia and Africa had been broadly unaffected by that crisis. And, you know, I can go back, because I worked in the bank and through the history of financial crises, most times they start as regional crises. That particular crisis was a crisis in the US housing market. But we've had the Asian financial crisis, we've had the Latin American financial crisis, we had the Mexican peso crisis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the IMF has recognized that its future lies heavily in regional relationships with strong regional partners, the bigger central bank, the regional financial institutions in those areas, to build first-line safety defenses of swap lines, other arrangements, ready to be triggered when there's a financial crisis. So whatever the debate about ownership and control in Washington, these institutions are beginning to move to fill the needs and voids out there to secure the continuation of international development and the management of potential financial risks. And then just, if I may, one final point on it. The issue is, are the shareholder governments going to move with them? Is there going to be the courage and statesmanship to replace a US whose role may be more limited and more unipolar in future? And there, I think one turns the question back to audiences such as this, because, you know, you can certainly point to all the caution and conservatism in my own region, Europe. You know, we've heard, you know, of governments being much more interested in immediate crises than stepping up this sort of vision. I think one can make that same argument about pretty much every region in the world. So the question is, will leaders recognize these growing needs and back these institutions to step up and fill them? And I think, again, it is forums like this where that collective will get seeded and born and develops. I agree with Gramsci. We're in a twilight, but I think it's in the hands of all of us to come out of that twilight, to find the bright sunlight afterwards of a reorganized multilateral system which better reflects both the crises of today, including imbalances, such as the one that's prompted the crisis we're in now, and comes up with new solutions to them and new governance arrangements, yes, coalitions of the willing to address them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, because you already give us some options moving forward. So Eric, Mark mentioned two things. MDBs as a system can be already a pillar of moving forward in thinking about how we are going to reorganize or to reimagine global governance. And number two, this regional dimension. And this is like trade. When we see people dealing with tariff, the policy option is to do more trade among your neighbors. This is what's happening here in Asia. Japan, China, South Korea are deepening their relation. And when you think of a regional initiative, we have in Asia AMRO, the famous Shanghai, the underpinning of Shanghai Initiative, who last week have agreed, the three main countries and three main shareholders, to commit capital to become a de facto type of Asian monetary fund. So Eric, you see already that these two pillars, MDBs as a system, and you are working at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and regionalization can be the way forward.
Yes, and I just want to say first that I think I agree very much with the characterization that Mark gave. The key now is not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, to use the coalition of the willing to build on the existing institutions. I made basically 3 points in my initial remark was, these institutions, they can change and have changed. New institutions have come up like my own, and we can mobilize more resources, we can help prepare more projects, and we can also introduce new elements for reform, like I mentioned co-financing, which I think is one of the main drivers of reform right now. And finally, we need to think, and again, Mark mentioned this, this way we have done development assistance probably was not very optimal. We were very tied to it, we were very invested in it, but it was a very patronizing system, and I think we need to rethink that, and again, we should make good use of a crisis to try to think how can we get a development assistance system that is much more based on the desires of these countries, and where they are co-owning these policies, and where they are making use, for example, of the climate change and the need for climate mitigation to get access to technologies that they could never have done before, be part of global value chains that really can shape their future, to get access to capital that they could never have gotten in the past. So for them, and I see it, I see it in Asia, I see it in Africa, I see it in Latin America, that this is what governments are doing now. And I think that's where the system has the potential for changes. If you look at the MDB system, what I really think, if we start thinking as a system and including the IMF, so both the development side and the financial stability side, because you said the global financial crisis did not have so much impact on much of Asia and Africa, but the Asian financial crisis had very major impact. So I think it's, if you go back over crisis, it differs how much the impact is in countries. But if you are at low levels of development and you are, maybe weaker institutions, you are more vulnerable. I think one of the reasons why we haven't seen more impact of the massive shocks to the global economy over the last, say, 10 years or so is the fact that the institutions in these countries, the policies, the macro frameworks have improved quite a lot in these countries. And I would say also that the IMF has become more agile in responding to these. So if we start thinking of the MDBs as a system and the IMF as part of the system, if we think of the MDBs as having more or less the same owners, in slightly different constellations, But if you start looking at as one balance sheet, that really enhances the capacity of the system, will bring down the cost of capital, will make us more possible to lend more and keeping less capital in reserve. So I think that's the perspective, and there are many aspects of this when it comes to, for example, liquidity management, the possibility of offering local currency financing, which is going to be so critical to deal with the massive capital flows to emerging and developing countries that we needed. So I think these institutions can change, new institutions can contribute, and we are doing this for emerging and developing economies. These are the economies that are most exposed to failures now of dealing with the global challenges. If we cannot address the climate change, if we cannot develop our capacity to adapt or to be more resilient, it's going to be the emerging and developing countries that will suffer from this. As I said, the uncertainty created by current policies, the countries most affected are the emerging and developing countries. So it's for their sake that we need to build on the existing system, use the capacities we have, and the willingness, the political will to drive change. I think that's the future.
Max, if I come to you and after Professor Shi, so we have been discussing here about policy options, coalition of the willing, the role of MDBs, regionalizations. I want to ask you the following also. Do you see in this new landscape moving forward, can the G7 and the G20, be still the forum for international economic cooperation, or you think with the current change of global economic order, this forum will also be gone?
Well, another moment of crisis, 2008, and what the G20 did, and compared to what it's doing today, I would say no. The answer would be probably a straight no. The G7 has become a club of Western economies, so I think the ability of acting in a global economy which has completely changed is limited. But maybe this leads me to 2 points, and I found what Mark said about regionalization of the arrangement to deal with crisis, financial stability issue, etc., as crucial. And but before I do that, I just want to mention what could be the trigger of this to get out of this twilight area or this transition phase. If I think about history, many people compare Liberation Day to Nixon moment, a unilateral act, political act of great importance by the US. At the time was about gold convertibility, today is about tariff and the role of the US dollar. I suspect that a trigger of a substantial change, which in the end will force everybody to come to a table and discuss, is likely to be the fiscal situation in the US. Because I think that this is a very important point of debate also for investors. What is this US exceptionalism that we have been experiencing over the last decade? Is it true that this is dictated by a dynamism and the AI revolution in motion that will propel the US, as Professor Rubini was mentioning last night, to a continuation of this US exceptionalism? Or instead has been fueled by rising debt level? That's a question that I think is still, we don't have an answer yet. And very often the truth is in the middle. But there is no doubt that if I compare the performance of the US of the since 2009 with the performance of Europe, for example, the amount of debt which has been issued by the US, it is basically 4 or 5 times what Europe did. There is no doubt that the US eventually will hit a wall, either because investors will be less likely to buy US Treasury or because interest rates become too high and then unsustainable, that eventually we'll have to deal with this debt. And then I think this could be the trigger of a deeper conversation about the global financial architecture, the role of the dollar, exchange rate, etc., the famous Mar-a-Lago Accord and all the sources that we hear about it. Normally you need a trigger. So that's the first point. The second one is about the regional versus global governance. I found this very fascinating. I always thought, when I look at the world in the last 10, 15 years, I look at maybe a little bit more, less at the politics and more at the currency and the financial market. We are moving towards a multipolar system where you have, in the currency, you have three main areas, euro, dollar, RM. More regional integration. We are seeing now this happening on trade, where you have more intra-regional trade rather than trade between big blocs, and for sure Trump is a factor of acceleration in this trend. So we are seeing the multipolar system shift, so I'm not surprised that the IMF and the multilateral institutions think we need to in some way go along this trend and adapt ourselves, also for survival, not just for because it's the best choice, or the let's say the best choice of all, but that's the situation. But the second question we need to ask ourselves is this effective to deal with the challenge that we face today? And here the answer is a little bit more complicated, because I agree that many regional financial stability issues are regional, but there are other challenges which are not regional. Climate change is one of them. Pandemics, if there is a new pandemic in the future of the world, we know that you need a global response. So there are issues that inevitably will require cooperation, at least between blocs, or some sort of coordination. And this leads me to another point, which is also very intriguing, is that if we are moving toward this multipolar system, where we are going to have three main regional blocs, apart that there will be a lot of free riders, in the sense that we already see that around the world. There are, they call it non-aligned, the one that say that they don't want to be part of one bloc or another. And I think this is going to be, can create a lot of disorder for sure, but I guess it's manageable. The question is this a global order made of regional blocs going to be cooperative or competitive? Because that's something which I think is not clear yet to me of the way forward. Because in a way, I would say that a competitive type of arrangement where regional blocs compete between them can also be positive, because it can also bring benefits. You have, competition is always good, also in this type of arrangement. But on the other hand, there is a global public good that we cannot neglect, which require cooperation. So I think there is not yet an answer to that. And the final point, what the financial sector thinks about all this. And that's, I think, also an interesting point of observation. You know, in banking and financial service, there is always one view. We like the level playing field. This is a word that is often used by lobbyists or people who talk to regulators, because for investors, and I think the same is reflected in the way banks look at it's always good to have a level playing field, because it allows you to make choice based just on pure economic and financial factors. Here, instead, we have a situation where you have to make choice by taking into account other factors, and this is a sort of complexity. So, thinking about an investor who will think about a global portfolio, what we're going to see is that before, an investor think about a global portfolio split across different regions based on purely economic and financial factors. Maybe we're going into a world where other factors, geopolitical, think about what's happening in the US with deregulation, Basel III change, and Europe, which is unlikely to follow. So we're going to see more of that, which is another source of complexity, particularly for a big institution which have a global portfolio. So this is going to be very interesting to watch.
Professor, yeah, multipolar world. You concur with this about that we are now heading toward a more multipolar world?
Yeah. I think to address the question is a little bit complicated, but I think even for the multipolar world, I think from a Chinese perspective, you know, although we have the conflict with you know, the US, but from a global perspective, a strong and a stable US economy is good for the whole world. So in this sense, so that we all need to do something to make the US great again. So, but this doesn't rely on the, you know, the tariff war. Instead, it's needed global cooperation. So that I think we can have, you know, do two types of things to achieve this target. Firstly, I think maybe the institution like the IMF could play a more important role. Because one of the reasons, like Steve Milan argued that, okay, because the U.S. take the dollar take too much kind of responsibility as kind of public goods to survive the global liquidity, safety assets, and a lot of things. Of course, the U.S. gain a lot dramatically from this kind of special law. But now, if the U.S. is to realize that this is a burden, okay, of course, I don't think the U.S. will let the renminbi take this law, okay? That's something U.S. don't want it. But from the the international money system, we do need another type of kind of safe assets. So like the Governor Zhou Xiaochuan said yesterday, so there might be the other backup or alternative kind of currency. So, but given the euro is subject to this kind of fiscal constraint, so that it's difficult for euro to take this law. So I think maybe IMF is needed to consider, develop a kind of global currency kind of possibility. So that's I think is the possible way. And during this kind of process, because the SDR, so that is kind of more other currency actually is involved in this kind of or indirectly become the major currency or the international currency. So also renminbi is one of them. So I think that could be accepted by the US. So and that is I think one thing to reorganize the international system and slightly, but don't completely block the existing one. Okay, that's something we could do. Second thing, I think we might be need have another type of AIIB. So the current AIIB is the Asia, but maybe we need to have the American infrastructure investment banking. Okay, so that because I think for a lot of people, Asian people, especially for Chinese, if you go to the US, you will realize, the infrastructure investment in US is much slower than the development in the Wall Street and the Silicon and the others. That's but this is really important. As I said before, this is very important for the the return of the manufacturing. So as a Chinese, we don't want to keep all the manufacturing in China. It's okay for us to return, but the decision is not decided by our side. It's decided by the Wall Street. It's decided by this kind of Silicon Valley firms. Okay, but when they make the decision, okay, they need to compare and do a lot of things. Okay, so the infrastructure is definitely something should be taken into consideration. So that's I think the whole world could be do something to organize this kind of thing to help the U.S. to do instead of this tariff war. Okay, so I think both suggestions may be a little bit naive, but maybe give some kind of light for this to end this kind of the trade war. So we also show that okay the whole world actually is still want to U.S. Be the major power leading the global economy and provide the huge demand and huge technology moments. So I As the last one, I just make a short comments. I think that's something I want to say. This is, can be a strong but a stable kind of power, and then the global system can be stable. Otherwise, that will be a long kind of dynamic process with conflict and uncertainty. That's not something we want, even from the Chinese side. Thank you.
Max, you wanted to say, yeah.
Very quickly, because I think, we don't have the time to go deep, but there is a wild card here, which is technology, which I think is also something to keep in mind. And in particular, I'm referring to something that in the financial service industry is very much in focus, which is the whole question of digital currency, which actually could become at the sort of level through which there will be a sort of an agreement eventually down the road. Because what's happening, and this also came out very clearly from the US administration, is that there are clearly two different views floating around the world about digital currency, in particular in central bank and digital currency. One is a stable coin from the US, the other is a CDBC from Europe. I think we are reaching the point very soon that we will know exactly how this stable currency from the US will work. The feeling is that the US clearly sees stable currency regulated with a peg to the dollar, 1-to-1, as a tool to maintain the dominance of the US dollar maybe for a little bit longer. On the other hand, this is opposed by the European Central, there is a different view in the European central banks, which instead highlight the risk to financial stability that comes from the stablecoin, apart from all the conflict of interest that we know exist around, let's say, the Trump firms and the people who will issue this currency. But I believe that maybe in a few years' time, we will be focused more on that rather than tariff, and we will discuss about that because we will see which one of these two models eventually will develop, because ultimately it's the demand from people which matters. Will stable currency or CDBC become the sort of a standard going forward? And also China, we are in China, as you know, is also very much into this digital currency story. So I think it's going to be the technology aspect of all this conversation, I think is going to become a big part of any future type of global order that we might think about it in the next few years. I just want to put that on the table.
Eric, you wanted to say something?
No, yes, I didn't really respond to your question on the regional arrangement. So I think there's something very fundamental here about, what you think of how a regional arrangement different from global arrangements, and what really makes regional arrangements maybe more in the spirit of what I was trying to advocate, to giving more ownership to countries and getting these being their policy being implemented. When you are in regional arrangement, you are much more likely to be dependent on the decisions of others within that region. That proximity strengthens the willingness to collaborate, both in terms of trade, but also in terms of monetary arrangement, financial stability arrangements. Asia has huge potential for further integration, when it comes to trade, when it comes to investment, and we have seen actually quite a lot of benefits already from RCEP, for example, and some other trade arrangements in the region that are starting to have impact. Of course, for that we need more cross-border infrastructure. We need to link up countries stronger, using infrastructure to connect energy markets, using infrastructure to deal with water problems and so on. And here I think is another role for the multilateral development bank to really strengthen those arrangements. And of course, when we talk about solutions to climate, impact of climate change and impact of nature loss, many of these responses have to be regional. Of course, ultimately it's about the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and so on, or greenhouse gases, but it's many of the solutions are regional in nature, and particularly when you come to nature loss, that's very much regional.
Thank you. I think, unfortunately, we will not be able to take questions from the floor. Apology, because I received a message that our time is gone, but I want to really thank all our speakers, panelists for a very enlightening conversation. I'm a little more optimistic after this. Clearly, this is the age of multipolarity. Let's build the new rule of the game, because at the end, we don't want to go from one hegemon to another hegemon. So I think a world more multipolar, time to build the new rules. Thank you very much. Looking forward for the afternoon session.
尊敬的各位来宾，上午大会结束后，工作人员将进行会场清理，请您携带好随身物品。今天下午将要进行的是主题讨论2、主题讨论3、主题讨论4以及平行论坛。